Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Justice. Thank you so much for joining Jamaicans for Justice. I'm Mikkel Jackson, Executive Director.
And I'm Jade Williams, Policy and Advocacy Specialist.
So we start with our human rights recap of the week, and I think last week was an especially difficult week for the country. And we send our condolences to the family of young Jojo, Nikita Noel, a 9-year-old who was raped and then killed. And the allegations are that the perpetrator is the spouse of the mother. It's a brutal attack, and we've heard the condemnation from the Prime Minister, Minister of National Security, and several other public officials, but the public is outraged. Absolutely. And rightfully so. So we also extend our condemnation and again our condolences to the family. And what was startling for us is that when we are going through our mourning with the family, there was another case, if you will, that emerged during the week. There is an allegation from a young woman that she was stopped by 4 police officers.
Yes.
And she was asked to apparently withdraw funds after being found to have violated aspects of the Traffic Act. When she tried to withdraw the funds, there are allegations that the officers apparently raped her.
Yes, that's a summation of
Yes.
the allegations, yes.
And 2 officers have since been released and 2 are remanded. And there are expectations that the Director of Public Prosecution will be indicating whether or not the case will see some charges being laid. And it's a sad moment because, again, it's allegations, but it's somehow is a little bit alarming because these are officers that are expected to serve and protect us.
Yes.
And I think, Jade, we can use this opportunity to call on our parliamentarians that there is an opportunity again, following that 2018 recommendation report from the Joint Select Committee of Parliament, to make the necessary amendments to the Sexual Offences Act and other related pieces of legislation, such as the Offences Against the Persons Act. I think following young Jojo's issue being brought to the public, the Prime Minister made a statement that the offences will see greater charges, penalties within the Offences Against the Persons Act. And we await to see what those are. But we're also saying to the Prime Minister and the Parliament that the protective laws ought to be there more. And there are those among us, I know EFA Life co-founder Joy Crawford, Betty and Blaine and others have been calling for the sex offenders registry to be made public. And while we may have a difference about what public means, and I'm not sure if you want to quickly just outline that, Jade.
Yes, we just think that there should be a certain level of nuance to the access at this current time, just based on the fact that it is an offense-based registry and not necessarily a risk-based registry. So there is no consideration as to reoffense, and therefore we would want there to be some mechanism for the control of how that information is released to the public, rather than having general public access.
And to put it to the public, we're not protecting anyone. So let me shut down that narrative before it even starts. What we're saying is that there are vulnerable people who may very well be placed on that registry. And therefore it has to be a tier level that considers a risk, privacy, and what it really means. And one of the examples we use is that right now you do not have a closing age exemption in law. And therefore you may find, for example, a 15-year-old young boy who had sex with his 14-year-old girlfriend, who could very well be placed on the registry. So what we're saying is close those gaps, put protective mechanisms in place. But we do stand with the call that the sex offenders registry should certainly be reviewed, and those things are considered.
Absolutely.
All right. Yes, the right of the week.
Yes, thank you for bringing us into our right of the week. And we are talking today about your right to public participation as a citizen. So it means that you are qualified to register as an elector for elections to the House of Representatives. And if you are so registered, you can also vote in free and fair elections. So some people call it the right to vote, but we said the right to public participation. So you are able to participate in these public processes where persons are elected for the House of Representatives, and you are able to vote for those persons once you are an elector.
And it brings us into our topic.
Yes.
And it's a passion of mine.
Yes.
We're celebrating Black History Month, and there are conversations. I have a nuanced perspective on Black History Month. So for those who don't know, it emanated from the United States because of their own slavery institution that existed, Jim Crow laws that followed that. Eventually they got rid of it in 1965, I believe.
Recently, in 1965.
Yeah, very recently. So you're talking about racial segregation. So Black History Month within the context of the United States was intended to celebrate African Americans. Yeah. But you found that countries such as Jamaica, we have taken it on, if you will. And here at JFJ, again, we celebrate our Blackness every day, our Afrocentric features, even though I'm wearing the falls here now, if you will. But I'm not like Jade with the Afro puff. But we do celebrate our Blackness every single day. But we believed that there is an opportunity to do some public education so that our listeners can very well understand where we're coming from to where we are now. So a little bit of a context for us. We know that we were under Spanish rule, and the British colonized us and just committed human trafficking.
Yes, just to segue in the trafficking, because we did have a did you know, I'm not asking the team to put it up, but we had over 35,000 of those slave ship voyages between West Africa and the Americas, where we now are.
And they abolished the actual Atlantic slave trade, I think 1807.
Yes.
And Professor Verene Shepherd is listening, so I hope we're getting the dates correctly. We're talking from high school and university
That's
memory
why I'm
here,
not
Prof.
saying any dates.
But coming up now, you're talking about several rebellions and so on taking place. 1834, slavery was abolished. But there was a 4-year period while the whites got us accustomed to freedom, apprenticeship,
so they say,
as they call it. So we did not get our full freedom until 1838. But what is interesting during that period, and I know Bert Samuels, who is also going to be joining us, he has very strong opinions on this, and we share it. Following the abolishment of slavery, what you also had was that the white planter class got £20 million as payment for their losses.
Right.
But those who did the actual, I won't use the word work, but I can't think of a better term now, we got nothing. What we got were institutions that were designed, our education system, our health system, that was designed to keep the blacks, the poor blacks, at a particular class within society. And you were reading the article, Jade, where Orlando Patterson, for example, mentioned the education system and how the vestiges of slavery would have impacted what we have here today. So we're going to be having this discussion with Professor Verene Shepherd, Director at the Center of Reparations Research at the University of the West Indies, Chair for the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and Bert Samuels, Attorney at Law. And Bert, if I remember, on another interview, you said you also call yourself a Pan-Africanist.
Yes.
I practice being a Pan-Africanist. It's not a label for me, it's what I do.
Yes. Thank you so much to you both for joining us. Professor, if we could start with you and just explain to our listeners the importance of this call being made for reparation, so they really understand what reparation mean and why this call is being made.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all, and greetings to your listeners and viewers. Reparation means repair. It's part of that process of acknowledging that a crime was committed or a wrong was done, and that those who committed this crime or that wrong have a responsibility, legally and morally, to admit to the wrong and to commit to repair. And in this case, the repair we're talking about is reparatory justice. And reparation can take various forms. We know that the Jews got money. In the case of the Caribbean, we're talking about money to enable a development package, education, health, and so on. So in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about.
Yes, thank you so much. And Jade, I completely forgot to do the overview, but we're seeing here where we have had several calls being made for reparations. Jade, can you just walk us through quickly before we continue?
Yes. So we would have seen former principal and vice chancellor of the UE campus, Sir Arthur Lewis, calling for reparations for the Caribbean, talking about the plight of the Caribbean people and stating that the British is responsible for that plight. We also saw the Rastafarian community, who would have made numerous calls for reparations in their letter to Queen Elizabeth II, and Mike Henry, then a member of Parliament for Central and Clarendon, calling on us to develop a common position on the impact of slavery and the issue of reparations for the countries that would have had descendants of slavery. In the conversations that have come up, we would have heard, I don't know if I can even consider these responses, but we would have heard some comments from those persons who have accepted some responsibility for them and maybe their country's role in
You're talking Prince William's recently?
not Prince William, because I think Prince William was sufficiently criticized in the wording of what he had said, but I am speaking about, for example, Mark Rutten, I think his name is, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who would have made a comment in Barbados apologizing for the events of slavery and Netherlands' role in such. Laura, I don't want to butcher her last name, but I think it's Trevelyan. Trevelyan. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shepherd, who would have acknowledged her family's participation in slavery. And while we see the acknowledgements, I think we can all agree, or some of us have agreed, that it is not enough to apologize. And I think that's what Professor Shepherd is referring to when she speaks about reparatory justice, meaning money, enabling us to further our development that would have been stunted by the effects of slavery.
All right, thank you so much, Jade. Bert, to you, what is the call being made from where you sit?
Well, the call being made, I wish I could cross-examine Verene to give the detractors' position. Because she did say that those who were responsible, so our detractors often say they are dead, and the people, our forefathers, are dead. But we have intergenerational impact of slavery. We can see it around, the bleaching of the skin, how poor our economy is. The 1st of August, 1838, we walked away from the plantation without a penny in our pockets, no land, not formally educated, and being dragged back onto the plantation with vagrancy laws. We could not gather and be seeming to be unemployed. So we're trying to force us back onto the plantation. And we can see 27 years into freedom what happened to the people of St. Thomas when the Honorable Paul Bogle tried peaceful means and was ultimately hanged by a group of white judges, court-martialed. So what is it? It continued after slavery. Let's just not think that freedom meant the end of suffering for Jamaican people. In fact, some people had 3 meals or 2 meals during slavery. After a while, starvation and impoverishment took place. And Queen Victoria at the time, Queen of England, when the people of St. Anne wrote to her 27 years into their suffering under colonialism, she said they should work harder. She had no feelings for us.
Yes.
And if you look at King Charles of England, he sits on a throne which was itself involved in slavery. The Royal African Company had a monopoly in the Atlantic Ocean to move enslaved people. So it is on the throne, it is among the subjects, and it can be traced. And if you go to a particular website, you can see the families which are still around who have benefited from it. That's my statement.
And just to add to that, thank you so much. You know, Mr. Samuels mentioned the issue of no lands. Some of our earlier political rights, for example, being able to vote, was premised on land ownership, having access to property. And I think as we have this conversation about what colonialism and our rights really entail, we have to get a sense of where we're coming from and what it really means, and why we shouldn't be quickly talking about giving up rights. But we're going to take a break. Mr. Samuel, just stay with us for a few, take the break, and then we return.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. Today we are talking about colonialism or rights development and reparations, and we are joined by Professor Verene Shepherd and Bert Samuels, attorney at law. Prior to the break, Mr. Samuels, you mentioned one of the challenges that come to champions of reparation is that those persons responsible are dead, and those persons affected are also dead. So who makes the payment, and where does the payment go? And I just want to pose that question to you as a champion for this kind of thing. What would you respond to that and say?
Okay, so I can put on my lawyer's hat. So if my child unfortunately passes, I can sue the owner of the car in a car accident. Although she's gone, I can sue for her wrongful death and her suffering. In fact, the law goes further. If she were in pain for 3-4 days and passed, God forbid, I could charge and also get compensation for her suffering. So the law recognizes that the victim, though dead, can benefit the survivor. Mm-hmm. And that principle is what we can use. You know, my great-great-grandfather, Edward Samuels, was a slave boy in 1838. He was 7 years old. He was sent to the fields too. So my bloodline is so closely connected. I mean, when Cameron came here and said we shouldn't peer into the past, he was at the same time the year before laying a wreath for the victims of the Holocaust in London. Mm-hmm. So people are very selective as to whose memory they want to put on the front page. But our suffering is so obvious. The Bogle family is still around. I have members of the Bogle family who are my clients, and they have not been compensated for the death of their great-great-great-grandfather. So there's inherited suffering, which is patently clear among people, and history knows that people have been compensated for what has been done to their generation, because intergenerational poverty is so obvious in Jamaica. You know, any person who traces their generation 3 generations back, you find they're poor black people. So easy to pick that up. So that's my position.
Thanks so much. And one of the things Mr. Samuel said, just to advise the listeners, you're talking about the Holocaust, Jews affected by what happened in Germany over a 12-year period.
Yes.
And, you know, persons even in the United States, globally, they're afraid to use certain terminologies. But you see that sort of hesitation to acknowledge the almost 200 years of injustice that blacks suffered through. So my question to you, Professor, for those who may still not understand, we're asking for an apology, compensation, what else to do exactly, what with those funds? If they're received.
Right. So let me go to the kind of blueprint we're using, which is the CARICOM Reparation Commission 10-point action plan.
Yes.
So let me run through what we're asking for. Full formal apology, Indigenous Peoples Development Program because of Indigenous genocide, repatriation for those who choose to go back to Africa, the building of cultural institutions because we don't have as many museums and so on to showcase our pain as the colonizers showcase ours and theirs. Attention to the public health crisis. We all saw what COVID did to us. and how it showed up our vulnerabilities in the health system. Illiteracy eradication and attention to education, the elimination of structural discrimination in education. An African Knowledge Program to rebuild bridges of disconnection, psychological rehabilitation, facilities to do that because of the trauma that we still go through as people of African descent because of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans. And I'm so happy you use the word trafficking. Not many people do that. Technology transfer and debt cancellation, and the return of the 20 million the current equivalent of the 20 million compensation money that was paid to the enslavers at the time of emancipation. And it's not just 20 million and the equivalent of what that is today, but it's also what Professor Beckles calculates as 27 billion more in free labor through the scamming called the apprenticeship system, the so-called apprenticeship system, where our ancestors were told work for more, 4 to 6 years, but we still won't pay you. Yes. Because the planters had already negotiated that they wanted 47 million. So that's the kind of plan that we have. And the various committees on reparation, they are going through and working their way through that. And I want to agree with Bert. Listen, this state continues. If the state of Jamaica has a debt, whichever government comes into power has a responsibility to pay that debt. So the debt for the crime continues. And Bert has already spoken about intergenerational responsibility and suffering. And if you will allow me, those who are interested in pursuing the financial compensation and hearing how it's calculated today, there is a conference, 2-day conference taking place on the 9th and 10th of February, that's this week, yes. Thursday and Friday. Judge of the ICJ, Judge Robinson, he's presiding over this conference. And the whole process is to show us through some financial scientists how today we should go about calculating the monetizing reparation. That promises to be very interesting. Those who are interested should call 876-561-0025 for how you can join this virtual conference. Path-breaking. We have had many calculations before. This one will be the latest.
Yes, we definitely look forward to that, because there are several things in the CARICOM's plan that jumps out at me, some of which, we're privy to already. And, I don't think we are educated enough as a people. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if successive governments have done enough. We've heard Mike Henry, he has been a champion for this. Yes. But, as Professor spoke about like debt cancellation and there was the uproar recently about what going back to the IMF really meant, whether it's an insurance as some call it or whether it's a loan. And while we may very well agree with it, the conversation is, should some of these debt that we're still paying for, mm-hmm. should they have been forgiven? What is the institutional entrapment?
Not forgiven.
Yes.
I don't use the word forgiven.
Yes.
You can't for over 500 years exploit a region.
Yes.
Extract its resources using forced labor from the continent of Africa. And you become wealthy. And then you're going to turn around and say, you don't have any responsibility. You can just say, here's your independence and go. Yes. And you quoted Sir Arthur Lewis. That was 1939 yes. when he called for reparation. And in the same year, a British MP acknowledged that they were responsible for the plight of the Caribbean and that they should pay reparation. So the Jamaican National Council on Reparation, all the other committees, what they are doing are simply working towards what is a right. And it is not any debt forgiveness. And all these grants and loans that the EU and others keep talking about, we reject those terms. They owe us, and therefore what they are doing is just giving us down payment on the entire debt. That's my view. And even the Trevelyan that you can I just say quickly, it is a very interesting case. The Trevelyan's claimed compensation to the tune of 26,989 British pounds for 1,004 enslaved Africans they owned in Grenada, 6 plantations. And today, that computes to 25.8 million. That's the 2020
And they're
value.
setting up a trust of how much?
One family.
100,000 pounds.
Wow.
No, it's good to put things in perspective when you look at it in dollars and cents, if you will.
And the question that brings to mind is what the parallel between how they were easily able to compensate for the Holocaust that we've already mentioned,
Yes.
whereas this has been a continuous debate since the end of slavery till now. The Holocaust would have ended in 1945, and the Jews were compensated.
But they still get money.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. So the acknowledgement and compensation for that injustice continues, whereas our death toll and length of time that we would have suffered would have been longer.
And Bert will tell you about Haiti.
Oh my God.
Haiti, how dare they took the freedom very early. Eh? And our producer is reminding us when you look at Pearl Harbor, the March Trail of Tears in the US and so on, and how those things were dealt with. So again, the question then becomes, blacks are still being treated unfairly, unjustly in everything.
Yeah.
If you will.
Can I come in here with...
Please, go ahead. We're going to go to the break in a minute, but please go ahead, Mr. Samuels.
We just want to discuss some left behinds, like the Tainos. They were wiped out by the Spanish. The artifacts which have been stolen from all over the world, including the Carpenter's Mountain in Clarendon. And the British have taken the Tainos' gods and images, and they have kept them in their museum. They must be returned to Jamaica.
Yes. Mr. Samuels, before we take the break, I just want you to wrap up for us quickly. I'm not sure, producer, we should take the break now or go ahead. But let me ask the question until when we return from the break. I just want you to just quickly explain to the listeners, when we talk about that connection between reparation and human rights, what exactly that means, just to tie up that part of the conversation, because some of them are sending us messages that from their perspective, they don't understand what human rights have to do with reparation and why we're having this conversation. So if you could just summarize that for us after the break.
Jamaicans, for justice, the people's champion.
Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. We're taking back the concept of Black History Month. It's not something that is only, one of those little feel-good things that started in the United States, but we're using it as an opportunity at JFJ to really educate the population about the injustices of the past and what we need to do as a country in better educating ourselves about our rights, our past, as Marcus Garvey has always been articulating to us. By the way, my former lecturer, Rupert Lewis, you taught me a lot, I must say. It's certainly welcome. We have on the call with us Bert Samuels and Professor Verene Shepherd. Mr. Samuels, before the break, I was asking you just to explain to the listeners the importance of reparation when it comes to our human rights. So what exactly is the significance or the connection from your perspective?
All right, the starting point for me is a case in England in 1772 called Somerset against Stuart. So here was an enslaved man on a ship out of the English harbor, I think, and a lawyer brought an action whether he could be held as an enslaved man in England, whether slavery was permissible in England. That is the denial of your liberty, which is one of the strongest points in human rights. And the court held that not so on English soil. Slavery was not permissible on English soil. So when we argue about the wrongness of slavery and human rights, we are saying, how could an enslaved person be in one part of the British Empire and in another part he can't be an enslaved person? So this connection between our freedom, which we were denied, the question of human trafficking, the fact that today we are assisting the British to fight human trafficking, turning a blind eye to the fact that they trafficked in us for so many centuries.
Yes.
And come and asking us to hold hands with them today when they were fighting against us and created human trafficking, which again goes against our human rights. So the answer to that, the connection is clear. The hypocrisy of Europe, where for her citizens, they had human rights. For us, we were denied human rights, not for 12 years, but for centuries.
Yes.
So the interconnection between that thing that the British love to say, our laws, and, you know, a lot of lawyers themselves embrace British laws, not knowing that it never applied to us for most of our time in the Caribbean. So there's this connection between the denial of human rights, the freedoms, and the hypocrisy that it obtained in their country. And at the base of slavery is racism. That's why we treat the Black Asian Africans a certain way. We treat Black people a certain way, where our suffering must not be spoken about. But if the suffering of Caucasian people is the real problem, because somehow the Bible that they relied on cast us into the cursed race.
But if I may jump in,
Please.
The development, for example, there is the right to development, the belief in the right to development, and the UN talks about the right to development. We have the right to development. And so that's a right. It's a human right, the right to development. Also, many of the countries that harmed us, they are signatories to the United Nations Convention, the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So if you subscribe to that, you have a right to eliminate racism from your space, and also to grant rights. There are many rights enshrined in the ICERD. And Jamaica is a party to the ICERD. 182 countries are parties to the ICERD, including, as I said, European countries. So, and also taking people against their will from a country and trafficking them across the waters to lands unknown, that's a violation of a human right. And then you pass laws to make these people, to deem these people chattel. That's a violation. And then you punish people for standing up for their rights, the right to freedom. Bert talked about what happened at Morant Bay, but also going back to Chief Techief in 1760, to those hanged for 1824 in Hanover and 1831-32 Emancipation War. These are violation of rights. So reparatory, and that's why it's called reparatory justice. It is to right wrongs that were committed against our ancestors, like my great-grandfather, Alexander Mighty, born into slavery in Hopewell, St. Mary in 1829. So he wasn't born in Hopewell, but he was born in Golden Grove, St. Catherine.
Yes.
So these are rights that have been violated, and we are saying we are people. Our ancestors were people, not chattel. You made them chattel. And we have a right to our dignity and to our names and our culture. Those are human rights.
Yes, thank you so much. Because, Jade, we were even having that discussion yesterday that, a number of people listening in would say, but these are still the past things.
Yes.
And, I loved when Mr. Samuels was speaking earlier, in particular on this point, around intergenerational poverty. We made mention to Orlando Patterson's report and that connection to the remnants of slavery and the social and economic rights that are still denied to so many Jamaican citizens as a result. One of the discussions we're going to be having, Bert, during this month is one of the issues of laws that still remain on the books that are grounded in racism, if you will. The Obia Act, for example.
Yes.
Some Caribbean islands, they still have the seditious laws.
Even parts of our Towns and Communities Act and some of those kind of vagrancy directed legislation are rooted in racism.
Exactly. You talk about political participation, but if I want to protest, I have to make an application to the police.
Yes.
People don't understand the importance of these things, and it's something that we're going to be doing getting more education around. So I think my question in closing to you, Professor, before we ask Mr. Samuels for his last comment, if Jade
Yes, that's it.
has as well, is what more can be done in terms of advocacy, public education, so the Jamaican people rise up and understand the importance of these issues?
Well, I think people have to understand that they have human rights. We have a Charter of Rights, after all. And some of the rights that we are trying to correct are rights which were taken away from us in the past and which we still don't have. We have the right to quality education, and yet we have structural discrimination in our education system. We rank our people, uptown, downtown, good school, good here, bad here. We have a right to our person, to our safety, to housing, and yet these things were taken away from us, and we are still struggling to get them. So there is a contemporary need for us to keep lobbying for our human rights and for the right to live in dignity. Advocacy is important. The National Council on Reparations, both of us are members here, Bert and I, and we have the CARICOM Reparation Commission and we also have our advocates network and all the people in media like you, congrats on the program, who are saying you are entitled to rights and you must insist on your rights. And we are doing at the University of the West Indies, of course, Center for Reparation Research. You talked about your education there. I taught history there for many years. We are using all hands on deck to try to educate us about people about their rights. And many people, Bert, as you know, say Africans must come into this conversation. And they are coming to Jamaica, by the way, on March 2. They are kings and queens and chiefs and chiefstainesses from Africa who will be speaking to us frankly at the University of the West Indies on the 2nd of March from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Call us at the Center for Reparation Research. We're helping to organize it. And we're saying, speak frankly. Let's sit down and have a conversation so we can understand each other and what happened and how we can put things right and how we can connect. And that African reconnection we're talking about, how can we have better Africa-Caribbean relations as one people? So we are advocating, teaching, educating on all fronts.
Yes, excellent work. And we can commit, Professor, that we will be calling, getting the information and ensure that we share it via this medium and or social media platforms.
And cover the event.
Yes.
Or the events when they happen. Yes.
Definitely. Mr. Samuels, your last call in terms of the issue, the matter of reparation.
Yeah, I think the pain I suffer every day I go to the court and hear them saying, God save the king. It shows a miseducation that no one has asked us to maintain that misnomer about God save the king.
And you still have to be saying, my lord and my lady.
Yeah, my lady and my lord. So this morning, every court in Jamaica, except for the Court of Appeal, opened with God save the king. And 3 months ago, we were saying, God save his mother. How can we do that? When we want to appeal, we have to get a visa from them to go to our appeal.
Exactly.
And about 60, 70 years ago.
Are we not talking about the royal family in slavery?
Yes.
And in our condition today.
But you see, as you spoke about that, the young people that, Jade are not bashing any Gen Y today. I won't at all. We rely on their advocacy. They're strong youngsters and they don't keep up certain things that we suffer through. But when you look at some persons, for example, go on these page 2 articles and look at what clothing items Meghan Markle and what's the other Kate wearing and so on. As you were talking, I don't think people are seeing the connection, Bert. We're just looking at it from a social perspective that the clothing items look good.
It's our money.
Yes.
Remember what Verene said? We don't have the museums where we can show the chains
That's right.
and the things that stop our mouths from opening to eat cane. We don't have the museums to show the children. So what we're showing them is what comes on the screen, and they are miseducated. But it's our duty, and Verene is, the books that are being written by us, when we tell our story with what is what will help. That is why it's difficult to tell the people that God save the king in the courtroom is bad. There are lawyers who see nothing wrong with it.
Yes.
But we write the books, Bert, we write the books from our perspective. We tell the truth, and yet history is not compulsory in the school. So how are they going to know what we know and what we went to the archives in the developed countries, the colonizers' countries, to see what they wrote about us? And yet they were trying to miseducate us.
Yes.
We are telling the truth. We have the books, and yet our books are not being used in the schools, and history is not compulsory.
Yes.
Orlando Patterson made that suggestion, and that recommendation is in his report. And I hope the government of Jamaica will take that recommendation on board.
Have you seen the civics book, Professor, to see if some of these areas are included in the civics curriculum?
Civics is not history. Civics is not history. It was never intended to be history. Neither is social studies.
Yes.
Nothing can compare or replace history education to teach young people about themselves, about their past, that their history did not begin with enslavement, that they are from glorious African countries. I'm telling you, the kings and queens and chiefs and chieftainesses are going to come to Jamaica. They will be in Jamaica, and you will see royalty, African royalty. So the miseducation, we jump up and down every so-called Black History Month and talk about it, but after that, what?
Yes.
We forget about it.
Yes.
Only 1 month, the shortest month in the year? Come on. We need to wake up and do the right thing by our children, and yet we complain. Crime and violence cannot be only solved the way we're solving it by that force and other violence.
Yes.
Education is the key.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate this energy, passion, and knowledge sharing. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Bert Samuels, Professor Verene Shepherd.
Thank you so much for having us.
Take care.
Okay.
We take the break.
Welcome back to Let's Start Justice. I beat you up for that one, Mikhail.
You did. That's fine.
We are in the call-in section of the show. I just want to quickly read out the numbers. You can give us a call in studio at 676-4996 or give us a WhatsApp at 2397583. Mikhail, what are we talking about?
You know, as both Bert and Professor were speaking, there were just a couple of things. And, I remember going to UA, and every time the conflict theory, the Karl Marx conversation comes on, I tell you, we just started having the talk about structural inequalities and institutional poverty trap. And when we trace our ancestry as individuals, it's how the poverty cycle has been perpetuated based on the family you're born into, based on the area that you grew up. And, historically, if we look at our education system, for example, every single year, I stopped 2 years or so years ago, there are some schools that always made it in that top 10. Good schools, the Campions, the Immaculates, always in the top 10. And then you look at a Denham Town, a Charlie Smith High School, at Tivoli Gardens, and so on. And you ask yourself, why are these schools always being left behind? Wherein if a child is to pass 3 subjects, you're a hero at those schools. But I remember going to Westwood High School in the country. You went to Hampton boarding school, very expensive. So, born in wealth. But you understand that boarding school take money. And when I was going to Westwood, I remember if you pass with 7 subjects, you walk with shame.
First of all, if what you're going to say is that you pass, you're already shamed.
Because it's supposed to Lego the thing that a 1 you get.
Yes,
maybe
it's not
2.
a 1, but 2 minimum.
Right, but they're talking about structural inequality that has been created. And, that Patterson report, and Professor spoke about it. How do we ensure that we create a system that is grounded in equity And you know my position on this hair grooming nonsense.
Yes.
Stop walk around and measure pitting the uniform to make sure that them ankle. Focus on values within the education system. Focus on putting resources to schools that are being left behind. Though that jumped out at me.
Yes, and I think it goes back to as well, the structural inequality goes back to even the teachers, because I think one thing that is under discussed is that a lot of the resources that you would see teachers use to keep their students engaged, they bought them themselves. They took it out of pocket.
I won't have JTA calling into the program now asking why it is important for wage negotiations to really consider these things.
Yes, and it is that if you are a teacher that is coming from a certain kind of socioeconomic background, you are in a better position to provide for your students than someone who is not, who is reliant on their salary, the salary that they receive. So, there is...
It's a lot. Professor spoke about it and in response to the question and I asked, and I agree with her, civics and history, they're two different things. We have a Ministry of Culture, and I think the minister and their technical team, they do the best perhaps with the resources that they have. So my statement that I'm about to make, it's not to bash the ministry. I don't want to be misunderstood.
It's with all caveats observed.
But I think much more needs to be done, which is why I personally don't agree with gender being tied to the ministry. Because I think when I look at a Ministry of Culture, it's to do public education around our history. Professor said it best, our history did not begin in 1655. We have a history that is grounded, growing up, I'm saying so many things, but growing up, Jade, when you hear about Egypt and reading that Bible, for example, you would think of pure white people.
Yeah, no, for sure.
I remember in my early days, I miss black people in Egypt.
Yeah.
So they talk about royalty and so on. And black people you're not talk about all along. You did not know this. So even how history is taught, that sense of pride. You're watching these TV shows, and even now a lot of people will ask for rights and justice from JFJ, but they're quoting the legal shows that they're watching on cable TV. So there is not a, people overseas can quote my constitutional right to bear arms, my constitutional right to do this. But in Jamaica, we're saying, I'm quick to give up my rights because I don't know what my rights are. What can be done?
I think Professor Shepherd also said something that was very important, and it was that the lens from which history is taught.
Yes.
And that's something I also realized while I was in high school learning history. Last time I learned history was in high school, but I realized that the teachers that made the most impact, that were able to bring me to a greater understanding of my personal history and our cultural history, were persons that focused on literature that came from here. And you find that a lot of the times the literature that we consume in order to understand our history is coming from a lens of our oppressor.
Yes.
And so if we don't challenge those narratives, then there are certain things, misconceptions about our own selves that we harbor.
That we don't have. Yeah, no, you're correct. And
I'm sorry to interrupt, but the hair grooming thing is really something that resonates with me. I grew up with locks, and my entire family had locks, and the amount of challenges, and I know you're familiar with my mother, so you know that she's, like Bert would say, I think she would also identify as a Pan-Africanist, and she does not tolerate that kind of thing, but also she was in a position of socioeconomic privilege where her challenge was accepted, and we've seen numerous times in even our media, even recently, where your challenge is delegitimized depending on where you are coming from.
Yes. It's something. There was a video of Excelsior High. I'm not sure if you saw that video. They had Afro Day.
Yes, I saw it.
And the young ladies had. I'm not hearing that, Karen. Okay, I guess that's in school.
Yes, some Excelsior pride coming through from our producer.
When you look at it, for example, the Afro hair, why can't our young girls wear their hair like that? My son asked me that question one day. I was saying to him to cut his hair, and he said, "Mommy, this goes against everything you have been teaching me." And I said, "What do you mean?" He was like, "What does my hair have to do with anything? Why can't?" And I said, look neat." And I regretted saying it because when he finished, I felt so ashamed by what I said, because he challenged me and said, would you have said the same thing had the hair had another text? I would. But I still felt ashamed how he reprimanded me for that. And that's the issue. Why are we so consumed with it? Why a youngster can't wear the hair puffy like yours to school?
I agree. And I think one of the things that my mother kind of did differently was always to acknowledge with us internally that they are wrong for wanting us to conform in this manner. But because we want to participate in these systems, we have to conform. So I think, as you would,
rules are not just rules.
Exactly.
Some rules, quite frankly, if time come for protest to be done, maybe, and I'm a big supporter of that 1938 labor rights. I don't want to go ranting today, but some rules ought to be rejected because they are not just, they are not reasonable at all.
Yes.
And it's something for us to really consider, Jade, as we talk about colonialism.
Yes, we have to challenge what mischief we're trying to solve every time that we put a restriction or some kind of guideline in place. Why is it here?
And the impact of it, you talk about the skin bleaching, the language that we use, the pretty hair, or you look pretty for a black girlie, and I'm to smile when those utterances are made. The issue of not being desired as a black woman as well.
And I'd even argue it extends to the young men as well, because I'd find, I have a lot of brothers, and they would speak about the comparison where you have a light-skinned coolie, quote unquote. I know that that's not a correct term to use.
Yes, we don't use coolie or Chinese.
But I use a quote. But you compare yourself and say, oh, she won't speak to me because she's talking to that guy.
Yes.
So I am automatically less desirable.
So that ethnic division, colorism within the country. All of these are remnants, and it's the time is coming upon us. But in sorry, Karen? But I tell you, we have one communications officer. We have to bring him around there for him to participate.
Yes, I have to bring him as a guest.
But, quickly, the show is going to be focusing on a number of things, colonial laws, the impact it is having today, my position on freedom of expression and protest and so on. So a lot of things will be discussed in coming weeks. So the trivia?
Yes, so we didn't do a trivia today.
Oh, we didn't? Oh, okay.
No, so it was just our Did You Know, which was that...
So no free credit today?
No free credit today, unfortunately. In a week of reparations, right? But what I will say is stick with us for the rest of the month as we cover this kind of historical context, talk a bit more about our Jamaican history and our moving forward and what that would look like for us coming out of this colonial mindset.
Yes.
So thank you guys for joining us for another week, and we look forward to seeing you next week at the same time, 1 p.m. I'm Jade Williams.
I'm Mikkel Jackson.
Jamaicans, by justice, the people's champion.